Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Greatest Hits by Harlan Ellison. Now, this is a collection of some of the most acclaimed short stories and novellas by legendary genre author Harlan Ellison. Now, Harlan Ellison unfortunately passed away in 2018, but this collection was published posthumously in 2024, but obviously all the stories in here were published decades earlier in different literary magazines or in other anthologies. I actually have another Harlan Ellison collection that was published in the early 90s called The Essential Ellison, and several of the same stories from that collection are also available in the Greatest Hits collection. That collection also features Harlan Ellison's novella The Resurgence of Miss Anklestrap Wedgie, which is not included in here, but I did actually review that book several years ago. Now, I mainly became familiar with Harlan Ellison being a fan of people like Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson. I, of course, heard Ellison's name mentioned in that grouping, but I also used to listen to this podcast called Radiodrome, and the main host of that podcast was freaking obsessed with Harlan Ellison and would reference him almost every 5 episodes, or would constantly make a reference to some rant that Harlan Ellison went on, so that's also what really got me interested in looking into Ellison's work. Now, Harlan Ellison is one of the most acclaimed science fiction writers of all time, even though he always resented that label, and certainly he's written so much more outside of science fiction. He wrote fantasy, he wrote horror, he wrote comedy, he wrote drama. I think in general, he didn't want to have any labels, he just wanted to be considered a writer. And I can understand that mindset, especially if you consider the time period Harlan Ellison came up in. During his time, if you had a label like a science fiction writer or a horror writer, you weren't really taken that seriously by mainstream literary critics or in certain literary circles, which obviously is bullshit, but we gotta look at the time. Stephen King obviously ran into that same problem. Now, Ellison's also written a lot for television. He's written episodes of The Outer Limits, Alfred Hitchcock Presents. He even wrote a Flying Nun episode, for God's sake. Now, one of the things that Harlan Ellison is most famous for is the Star Trek episode City on the Edge of Forever, which to this day is considered to be the finest episode of the original series, even though the script was heavily rewritten by Gene Roddenberry, and Ellison was not happy with the changes that Roddenberry made from his original script for that episode. It actually led to sort of a feud between Harlan Ellison and Gene Roddenberry that lasted for several years, and I know Harlan Ellison did not get along with William Shatner, although I think he did remain friends with Leonard Nimoy. Now, in the 80s, Harlan Ellison was the main story consultant for the 1980s reboot of The Twilight Zone, which, by the way, is so criminally underrated. Now, sure, the 80s series might never be as historically significant as the original Twilight Zone from Rod Serling, but the 80s series, I think, deserves a lot more recognition than it gets. And several episodes of the 80s Twilight Zone were either written by Harlan Ellison or were based on his stories. He's also written episodes of Babylon 5, as well as the 90s reboot of The Outer Limits. He's also written a lot of non-fiction, like film criticism and TV criticism, but he was arguably more famous, or infamous I should say, for his temperament. Oh yeah, if you pissed him off, he will let you know, and he did not suffer fools lightly, not at all. There's stories of him getting into physical altercations with people. I think sometime back in the 60s, he almost got into a fight with Frank Sinatra, which kind of took some balls considering Frank Sinatra had mob ties. Even though, from what I understand, it was Frank Sinatra who started that fight. There's a story of one of the shows he was working on. I think he got into a disagreement with one of the producers, and I think the producer said to him, "Shut up, you're just the writer, you're at the bottom of the totem pole here," and he apparently lunged across the table at the guy. In college, his creative writing professor told him that his stuff was crap and he'll never get published, and Harlan Ellison apparently punched the guy in the throat, which was probably not the appropriate response, although to be fair, there. A professor shouldn't be telling their students that. I mean, I understand not wanting to coddle your students and giving criticism when criticism is warranted, but at the same time, you shouldn't say something like that. There's a story of him basically launching a harassment campaign against the comptroller of, I think it was Signet Publishing, because they put a cigarette ad in one of his books, and he tried to get them to sell the publishing rights back to him, and they refused, so he started basically harassing this guy, and this culminated in him mailing a dead gopher to the publishing house.
It chanced that this happened right around the time that I've got Ezra Eisen's situation, and I've got to escalate to phase 4, and it's got to be a real number. Naturellement, I put little dead gopher, scoop up all the little brains, in a little box, along with Theodore R. Cogswell. You know Theodore Cogswell, Ted Cogswell, the science fiction writer? Theodore R. Cogswell's famous recipe for boiled gopher stew. And I mail it off to Ezra Eisen, 4th class mail. I am told that by the time it hit the Chicago shunting station, it was high. Ripo. We are talking here Mondo Puco. I get a call from Olga Vizeris that is so inarticulate, so crazed, she can't even speak. Wah, 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 wah. We had to have the mailroom fumigated. Wah. They didn't even need to deliver it to Eisen. The minute it came, I mean, postmen wouldn't go near it, man. They brought it in and fired it through a window at them, you know? And the goddamn thing, she said, Ezra Eisen went in for open heart surgery this morning. I said, I hope he lives. She says, why? So you can torment him? I said, no, he's got to have the strength to release my book.
He was also very, very litigious. After The Terminator came out, he infamously sued James Cameron, accusing The Terminator of ripping off his story, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which is actually included in this collection, as well as 2 of the Outer Limits episodes he wrote, Soldier and Demon with a Glass Hand. Also, if you get a chance, do yourself a favor and look up some of his interviews or talk show appearances on YouTube. He was fucking hilarious. He had a wicked, almost George Carlin-esque sense of humor. Honestly, he was kind of a brilliant comedian, even though he probably wouldn't label himself as such, and most of the time he probably did mean what he said. He was also close friends with Robin Williams. There's actually a video you could find on YouTube. It was recorded in the early 2000s, but it's basically just them sort of shooting the shit. He was also a huge advocate for civil rights and women's rights, even though he was also not a PC person at all. He did not give a fuck who he offended. Now, he has had some controversies outside of his anger issues, and this I really cannot defend. There was an incident in 2006, he was being presented with an award, and the woman asked him, now, are you gonna behave? And he grabbed her breast. I do think it was probably meant as a joke that in the heat of the moment he just took way, way too far, but that's still not fucking cool, man. I mean, I'm all for offensive humor, but you don't physically touch somebody like that without their express permission. Now, as far as I know, that's the only incident of him doing something like that. I don't know about any other incidents quite as egregious as that, but that is something that does make you go, But yeah, Harlan Ellison, despite his stories having almost universal acclaim, as a person, he was a very, very divisive personality. There were a lot of people who really hated him. In some ways, he was a wonderful person, and in some ways, he was kind of awful. It really depended on who you asked. But I don't think anybody can deny the talent that he had, and you can tell from his stories that he had a deep understanding of the human condition. His stories ranged from being funny funny, to scary, to thought-provoking, to genuinely moving. And both his stories and his personality has had an impact on popular culture. He's technically a character in Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns. In The Dark Knight Returns, it seems that nuclear war between the United States and Russia is inevitable, and Harlan Ellison is actually interviewed on TV at one point in that comic, and he says something to the effect of, "By the morning we'll be eating our toddlers for breakfast." He was also a minor character on Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated, one of the later Scooby-Doo series, and it actually was Harlan Ellison voicing himself on the show. Now, a few words on the collection itself. This collection was edited by J. Michael Stradinsky. I'm not sure if I'm saying his last name right, but he's a very well-known writer in his own right. He also created Babylon 5, and from what I can tell, he was basically a protege of Harlan Ellison. This collection also includes a foreword by Neil Gaiman. Keep in mind, this collection was published a few months before the allegations against Neil Gaiman came out. Now, I know this particular collection caused a bit of an uproar among certain Harlan Ellison fans because there is a disclaimer in the beginning about how some of the stories contain outdated cultural representations, and yeah, from everything I know about Harlan Ellison, I have a feeling that disclaimer would have driven him right up the fucking wall. Now, in this video, I'm going to review each individual story in the collection, and by the end of the video, I'll give sort of a top 5 of what I thought were the best stories in the collection. So the book is broken up into thematic sections, and each story in a given section is tied together by a similar theme. The first section in the book is Angry Gods, and the stories contained in this section are Repent Harlequin, said the Ticktockman, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, The Deathbird, Chatting with Anubis, and The Whimper of Whipped Dogs. So, Repent Harlequin, said the Ticktockman, was originally published in the December issue of Galaxy magazine in 1965. And basically, the story is set in a future totalitarian society where the most precious resource is time, and the worst crime a person could commit is to waste time, and especially waste somebody else's time. Like if you're constantly late for work, or you're late for a party or a date, and if you screw up somebody else's schedule, you could be punished for this. And you have this figure called the Ticktockman who sits in judgment of mankind, and if he feels that you're wasting too much time, be that your own time or other people's time, he will punish you for this by taking time away from you. But in the story, you have this guy who tries to rebel against the Ticktockman's rule, and he goes out dressed as a Harlequin gesture, playing pranks on people, deliberately wasting people's time, and what he's trying to do is he's trying to get his fellow man to wake up and realize that this is not how things should be, and try to get people to stand up to the Ticktockman. And the Ticktockman is going crazy trying to figure out who the Harlequin is. But yeah, this is a really good story. It's definitely a satire on social and societal norms, and you can tell that it's definitely reflecting the time period it was published. This being the 1960s, we were at the height of the Vietnam War and the counterculture movement in America, and you had an entire generation of people that were really sort of rejecting the stringent rules of the old generation. But it's also very much a story about authoritarianism versus anarchy, where you have the Ticktockman who uses time as a way to control people. He definitely represents authoritarianism, and then you have the Harlequin who represents anarchy and rebellion. And if you look at it that way, the story is still very much relevant to today's society. But the story is also quite funny too. It's basically a parody and a satire on George Orwell's 1984. 1984 is even referenced at the end of the story. Now, there was a comic book adaptation of this story, but in speaking of comics, I don't know this for sure, but I saw a lot of similarities between the Harlequin Harlequin and the character of V from Alan Moore's groundbreaking graphic novel V for Vendetta. The similarities are probably a coincidence, but it's still something interesting to think about. But in 2011, you had the sci-fi action film In Time with Justin Timberlake and Cillian Murphy. I've never seen the movie, but I know Harlan Ellison actually sued the filmmakers over that film, accusing it of being a ripoff of Repent Harlequin, said the Ticktockman, but he did later drop the lawsuit. I think after the movie didn't do that well, I think he was probably like, who gives a shit? Nobody's gonna even remember this movie in another 5 years. Hey guys, so for this section of the video, I'm discussing Harlan Ellison's 1967 sci-fi horror story, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, and I'm discussing this story with my friend Chris Espinal.
Hello everyone, how's everybody doing?
Now this story was originally published in, I believe, the March issue of If Worlds of Science Fiction in 1967, and this has become probably Harlan Ellison's most famous story, especially in recent years. I've noticed, like, a lot of, like, people on YouTube and the internet have really kind of latched on to this story.
Yeah, I mean, I understand. I mean, the more scarier it is, but it's almost as if he predicted a lot of things are kind of almost like coming to fruition. AI is becoming more of a dominant thing that people are using nowadays, and it's kind of scary, like, the way everything evolved and how relevant this story is right now.
So the plot of I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is, at a certain point, the Cold War escalated into World War III, and the war became so complicated and so complex that China, Russia, and the United States each developed their own supercomputers to sort of calculate the trajectory of the war and kind of just, like, help them understand what the hell's going on. But these computers all became self-aware, and eventually they all merged together into a supercomputer called AM, and AM grew to hate humanity and ultimately wiped out the human race, with the exception of 5 people who he now keeps trapped within the bowels of the earth, and he's keeping them alive. Like, the story itself is actually set over 100 years after World War III and after AM had already wiped out the rest of the human race, but he's essentially made these people immortal and is just keeping them trapped in what is essentially a mechanical hell, and he's essentially this artificial Satan sort of just torturing them for all eternity. And again, that's the basic plot of the story. It's not a long story. I think it's only like 13 pages, but yeah, no, the story is genuinely pretty terrifying.
Again, I cannot stress how relevant this story is now, because the 3 superpowered nations are, conveniently enough, the ones that are typically on the rise of having I mean, we're having issues with China, Trump. We're having issues with Russia, whether or not we should intervene with some of the matters or not. And it's again, the evolution of AI and it becoming more dominant in our society and how it intermerges with people. I think it's really amazing how this story captures what's going on today, as well as its influence in the movies, media, had his own video game adaptation, and you know, it's very unique. It touches on a lot of things of the resilience of a human being. I know that it shows the suffering and how twisted. I have to give props to the 5 characters and some of the things that they went through, because for them to go through the amount of years and torture that they went through and still keep any resemblance of the old. I believe one of the characters almost goes back to this very common thing that people in the past do when they used to tell stories of the past, and how it got to this point. It's very Greek. It's very, ancient in nature, but we still have it even in those circumstances. Some of the urges and things that they're reduced to having, they still do. I mean, they still have sexual desires. One of the characters, Ellen, she becomes basically a person that serves that need for almost all the
male characters.
The male characters, yeah. There's jealousy in between. There's turmoil. You know, one of the characters, Benny, I believe it's Benny, he gets transformed, deformed, right back to his primitive state into an ape-like creature. Again, you know, his features are more pronounced.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
And it's something that should be pointed out is the character of Benny is also gay, yet Am basically makes him straight, because a big thing is Am is able to change these people's personality. Like, even Ellen, before the apocalypse, she really wasn't like this. You know, she wasn't really as promiscuous as Ellen is now, but again, it's like Am changes these people almost more to their baser instincts.
And again, it could be implied, maybe, this is the mindset of characters that went through relentless amount of torture, you know, and having to deal with each other as well as the torture, and having to deal with their issues, and also trying to make amends with some of the things that they're envious, hatred of each other, who had the better end of the stick, who got tortured the most, who got blessed the most, you know, and those circumstances. And they still try to, as a team, try to work throughout all these problems and issues. You know, there's times where Am really psychologically fucks with them. There's times where he tells them that if you go all the way over here, there might be some food, there might not be, you know, and they'll come empty-handed, or they'll come, risk wasn't really what the reward, they get pennies, you know. And this is something they go through every fucking time. So every little thing that Am could quite possibly taunt them with, or suggest maybe you should do this, if they take it, they're doomed. If they don't, they're doomed. And it just puts them in such a condition where it's just a whole mess of emotions, and like I said before, it's crazy.
But one thing that should be pointed out about the story is the story on the surface is very nihilistic, especially the ending. This is a very dark ending, yet there is a strange positivity to the ending too, because at the end of the story, the main character, he does kind of beat Am, but not in a way he probably would have wanted, because he gets really fucked up at the end, but in a way he has kind of won his battle with Am, even if he did end up paying. And it's this idea that Am could destroy the human race. He could destroy these people's will to live, yet Am can't destroy the human spirit. There's something about the human spirit that's still enduring.
As much as Am is depicted as a god, can do anything, change the weather, alter what they see, put in an imagined laughter of and I don't know how they would know, but the laughter of a very full or fat woman, you know, a taunting of a person that is eating well, just to add into the psychological torture.
So you mentioned this already, but in the 90s there was a computer game based on this book, which actually had Harlan Ellison voicing Am, and from what I understand, the computer game does flesh out the characters a little bit more. Like, there's one character in the story who, in the game, we apparently find out was a former Nazi who's trapped down there with them. And I think the game also fleshes out Ellen's backstory a little bit. I'm not a gamer, but have you ever played the game?
I've never played a game. I have only saw videos to brush up on. He does put a lot of depth into the characters. In the video game, it's more fleshed out. You get the blessing to see how really animated Harlan Ellison really is, because he really goes off the walls with the character and the way he expresses them.
Oh, you can see that if you ever listen to like the audio book of I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which he reads. Like, that is, you were even telling me that it was actually kind of hard for you to listen to because he's just so erratic.
Yes. Not in a bad way, but it's like,
it works for like Am, because Am is such a psychotic character.
Yes. There's one thing I do want to touch on. Like, the reason why Am, or at least as far as how I understood it, the reason why Am hates us to such a degree is that once it becomes self-aware, once it merges with the other supercomputers and becomes one unit, it develops complex emotions that it doesn't understand. It can't self-terminate itself. It's just stuck with emotions, and it has apparently all the answers, but it can't answer the one thing of what makes us us. To a degree, I don't know, but this is how I'm reading it, picking out the 5 remaining humans, torturing them, putting them in endless amounts of torture just because of how much hatred he has, how much hatred that he was even created to be forced to have these emotions that it does not comprehend. And what better than to have 5 guinea pigs to, I don't know if it was a way of understanding how much he can really poke at them to see, or maybe that's his way of trying to comprehend what we are, our resilience, what we're capable of taking. And at the end of the day, Am really doesn't understand humans. It's powerful, it's godlike, it's not God. It can't bring back the people that Ted kills at the end. But, I really enjoyed this story so much.
Yeah, there was also a comic book adaptation of this story too, but I don't know if you've ever read that.
No, I have not.
But it should be pointed out that this story is said to be one of several Harlan Ellison stories that supposedly James Cameron ripped off for the Terminator. Mm-hmm. And there are some definite similarities between AM and Skynet from the Terminator franchise, and Harlan Ellison actually sued James Cameron, and apparently they settled out of court. But if you watch the Terminator at the end, there is a little thing at the end saying, inspired by the works of Harlan Ellison, which apparently James Cameron did not want to put at the end of the movie, but the court said, yeah, you kind of have to do this. Now, I don't know this for sure, but in Stephen King's Dark Tower series, there's a character called Blaine who is very similar to Am. So if you're unfamiliar with the whole Dark Tower mythology, it's set in an alternate universe, but it's heavily implied that this universe was a lot like our world thousands of years ago, but the people of this old society in the universe of the Dark Tower eventually wiped themselves out by trying to combine science with magic, and basically it was their own technology that fucked them over. But they did develop AI. Like, there actually are robots in the Dark Tower series. Yeah. And one of the villains of the Dark Tower series is this train called Blaine, which is basically a train run by an artificial intelligent computer system. And Blaine is very, very similar to Am. So I don't know if Stephen King maybe took some inspiration from I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream when he wrote Dark Tower 3, which is the first Dark Tower book to feature Blaine.
There's a lot of inspirations. I mean, at least I feel. There's that. There's also the android werewolves. Could be a Terminator thing.
Oh, yeah, from Dark Tower 5.
Yeah.
You could also see the influence of this story on movies like Cube and even The Matrix. But yeah, any closing thoughts on I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream?
I read it a long time ago, and revisiting it, I really appreciate it a lot. The first go around was just a quick read because everybody talks about it. My brother was talking about it, and I decided to give it a shot. And yeah, I like it. I really like the story. I like everything about it. I like the themes. A lot of things that he did there. I mean, keep in mind, this is what 1967, right? And this is when sci-fi wasn't really like that. At a time. So when going back, I try to put that in mind, and that's what really blows me away, is how he can really create a short story with the amount of emotion that evoked a lot of emotions.
The next story collected in here is The Deathbird, and this was originally published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction in 1973, and was later collected in Ellison's 1975 collection, Deathbird Stories. Now, this is a very weird and highly experimental story. This is also very much about Ellison's complicated relationship with religion. Now, Ellison was an atheist, but being a Jewish man, he obviously grew up with religion being a factor in his life. And when ranting about religion, he has said, and I'm not saying I agree with this because I do personally believe in a God, but he has said that if God does exist, then God is categorically insane. And in a way, that is what the story The Deathbird is about.
I find nothing more ridiculous and annoying than some guy who runs 100 yards, runs a kickoff back 105 yards from the end zone and drops to his knees and thanks God. Well, that's foolish. God didn't do it. He did it. Because if God did that for him, you mean God was against the other team? God is that mean-spirited that he has nothing better to do on Sunday afternoon than beat the crap out of a bunch of poor football players? I don't perceive of the universe being run by that kind of a god.
But basically, the story begins after an apocalyptic event, possibly the biblical Judgment Day, and we follow this man named Nathan Stack, who is risen from the dead by the shadow creature referred to in the story as Snake. Now, it appears Nathan has lived 1,000 lifetimes under 1,000 different names throughout man's history on this planet. But Nathan and Snake are journeying across this apocalyptic wasteland, literally to confront God. And it turns out both Nathan and Snake are characters from the Bible. You could probably already guess who Snake is supposed to be. I'm not going to say exactly who Nathan is supposed to be, but again, he is a character from the Abrahamic religions. So it's very much a story about theology, but told by an author who, again, has a very complicated relationship with theology.
The universe doesn't know we're here. It just doesn't know. Einstein says God does not shoot craps with the universe or does not play dice with the universe. Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. It's random. The universe will one day give you the lottery for $16 million the next day, colon cancer. The universe doesn't know. The universe doesn't care. The universe is just boogieing on along, having its own self a good time. There is no rhyme. There is no reason. There are laws, restrictions, rules, Darwinism, astrophysics, all of these things are part of the way the machinery runs. And it's a machine. Well, who created the machine? I don't give a fuck who created the machine. I'll never know. You'll never know. No one will ever know. If St. Thomas Aquinas couldn't figure it out, I sure as hell am not going to be able to. And neither are any of these pot-licking little stump ministers who always have the answer because they get messages from God. Now, I don't mind people getting messages from God, sending messages to God. What I mind is when God answers them. These kind of people we usually put away in a funny house.
But it's also sort of a sci-fi take on these concepts as well, because it does sort of play on the idea that what if God and the devil were actually aliens? There are also multiple moments throughout the piece when the plot stops and we get these little quizzes and questionnaires about religion, and they all have these very satirical questions about theology. We also get multiple side stories which are supposed to be about Nathan's past lifetimes, including one where his mother is dying of cancer and is begging him to kill her, and another one which is clearly autobiographical about Nathan being a writer having to put down his dog, and you can tell it's basically Harlan Ellison writing about himself during this section. So like I said, this is a very experimental story, but again, it's a really good one, but it's not a story for everybody, especially depending on what your personal views on religion might be.
I have a personal relationship with God. I love that phrase. Do you have a personal relationship with God? Yeah, God comes over on Sunday morning. We have bagel, lox, cream cheese. We go bowling on Friday nights. God and I were very close. I think it is presumptuous. I think it is presumptuous, and I think it is silly, because it makes you believe that you are less than what you can be. As long as you can blame everything on some unseen deity, you don't ever have to be responsible for your own behavior. And I think that is the ultimate mark of humanity. We were given, in our toolbox, tools to build ethics, courage, kindness, friendship, ratiocination, the ability to think, to work problems out logically, dreams, imagination, things that make us want to go to the stars, things that we want to make ourselves better. And a quiver of arrows, which are mean-spiritedness and greed and irresponsibility and the refusal to take responsibility for anything you do, and coarseness. And these things, they're like rocks. Instead of using the tools to build, we pick up these rocks of greed and stupidity and throw them at each other. And I suppose in some ways that's a very Christian attitude. I suppose in some ways it's a very Judeo-Christian attitude.
The next story collected in here is Chatting with Anubis, and this was originally published in a magazine called Lore in 1995. And this follows two archaeologists who uncover this tomb half a mile under the desert in Egypt, and they go down there and they encounter the Egyptian god Anubis, who in Egyptian mythology is the god of the dead. And it turns out Anubis is guarding a secret that scared Alexander the Great when he encountered Anubis. I'm not going to say what that secret is exactly, but it is something that ties in with theology. Even though the story is obviously taken off of Egyptian mythology, a very important figure from Judeo-Christian belief systems does play into this story. But this was a really good one. I enjoyed this story quite a bit. Now, there was a comic book series from Dark Horse called Harlan Ellison's Dream Corridor, and I believe this story was adapted for one of the issues of that series. The final story contained in the Angry Gods section of the book is The Whimper of Whipped Dogs, and this was originally published in an anthology called Bad Moon Rising in 1973. And this story is actually partially taken off of a real event, the murder of Kitty Genevieves, who was a woman from New York City who was assaulted and murdered in the presence of, I think, over 30 of her neighbors, and supposedly nobody did anything about it. Now, it turns out some of that is apocryphal. There actually were people who tried to help, but it's the common story that there were over 30 witnesses to the murder who did nothing because they thought, oh, that person will call the police, or that person will intervene and try to help. I'll just sit here and wait till that happens, and it's actually how the term bystander syndrome was coined. Basically, the story begins where this woman named Beth looks out her New York City apartment and sees another young woman being assaulted and murdered by a mugger in the courtyard of her apartment complex, and she sees that all of her other neighbors are also looking out their windows witnessing this crime, and nobody does anything about it. Then this woman witnesses something else, something that shouldn't be there. As the story goes on, certain things start happening to Beth, and it appears that she did something to displease the city, as if the city itself is a god. Perhaps all the violence in New York City has either awoken an ancient god or has created a very new god, but it's a god that demands sacrifice. And the whole idea is the courtyard of this apartment building where this woman was murdered in the beginning of the story. What if it was all some kind of an altar to this bloodthirsty god? But yeah, this was a really good story. This was actually one of my favorites of the collection. Now, even though this story was written 10 years before Clive Barker would come onto the scene, this actually reminded me a lot of a story that Clive Barker would write, especially the ending. Actually, this reminded me a lot of Clive Barker's The Forbidden, which is the story that was the basis for Candyman. And both sort of play on the idea that even in modern cities, ancient deities can still thrive, and there can still be legends and superstitions. And as the story goes on, we also get a sense that all the people in this apartment complex are essentially a cult, worshipping whatever this deity is. The next section of the book is called Lost Souls, and this contains the stories Jeffty is 5, Pretty Maggie Moneyeyes, Shatterday, Mefisto in Onyx, and On the Downhill Side. So, Jeffty is 5 was originally published in the July issue of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction in 1977, and this is a beautiful, beautiful story. It's honestly one of my favorites in the collection. Basically, the story is about this man who, when he was 5 years old, he became best friends with this boy named Jeffty, who is the same age as him, but as he got older, Jeffty remained 5, and now the main character is an adult, yet Jeffty is still 5. And it's not simply that Jeffty is mentally challenged and has the mind of a 5-year-old. No, he literally is a 5-year-old boy and has been a 5-year-old boy for over 20 years now. Now, despite this, the main character remains friends with Jeffty, even though the relationship dynamics have obviously changed by now. But soon the main character comes to learn that Jeffty did not simply stop aging. Somehow this boy exists outside of our current time-space continuum. Like, Jeffty has a radio, and on the radio he listens to new episodes of programs that have long since gone off the air, and he can even send away for items that no longer exist. He even has access to new issues of comic book series that have long since been discontinued. But while the main character starts to view this as a miracle, everybody around them, including Jeffty's parents, views this as this strange alien anomaly that just shouldn't be. And you kind of start to understand both points of view. And really what the story is it's a story about nostalgia. It's a story about desperately trying to hold on to a time and place that no longer exists. And Jeffty represents that for the main character. And it's also about how, for better or worse, as much as we want the past and the present to coexist, sometimes they can't. And sometimes the present can literally kill the past. And it's also about how the adult world, again, for better or worse, can sometimes corrupt childhood innocence, and we see that with the main character being an adult now. He has adult responsibilities, but because of his adult responsibilities, he can't be there for Jeffty when Jeffty needs him most. And the ending of the story is absolutely heartbreaking. And in so many ways, this is really a story about Harlan Ellison coming to grips with the fact that his childhood is never coming back. But once again, it's a brilliant story, and I could definitely see why it was included in this particular collection, and the story in some ways is almost more relevant today with just how nostalgia-obsessed people are now. I mean, today, nostalgia is almost an industry. Even though a lot of it is nostalgia for an idealized version of the past. But once again, it's a great story, definitely one of the best in this collection. The next story contained in here is Pretty Maggie Moneyeyes, and this was originally published in Night Magazine in 1967. And basically this is about a call girl who dies of a heart attack at a slot machine at a casino in Vegas, and then her spirit starts haunting the machine, and then she starts helping out this guy playing the machine who's sort of down on his luck, and she helps him win a bunch of rounds and sort of screw over the management at the casino. I know this is considered to be one of Harlan Ellison's best stories, but I'll admit, I thought the story was just alright. I don't know, this story just didn't do anything for me, but I'll admit, I probably read it under the wrong conditions. Like, at the time I read this, I was kind of like, I had a bunch of other shit on my mind at the time, so that's probably why I didn't enjoy the story as much as I should have. But I do have this story in the other Harlan Ellison collection I have, so if I ever do get around to reviewing that collection, maybe by then I would have reevaluated this story, but as it stands now, I just thought the story was alright. I actually like the story of how Harlan Ellison came up with this story better than the story itself. Harlan Ellison actually based Maggie in this story off of a friend of his who was a sex worker, and he ran into her one day after he did this movie called The Oscar, which was a film he co-wrote that he even admits is one of the worst movies ever made. After they shot the movie, the producer was holding an after party in Vegas, and Harlan Ellison ran into this friend of his, and that's when he got the idea for the story, and he went back to his apartment to write the story, but he apparently stripped naked and had the air conditioning on full blast, so he got pneumonia. So basically a maid found him the next day when he was halfway through the story, like, passed out over his typewriter, sick as a dog, and they sent him to the hospital, and he ended up finishing the story in the hospital. The next story contained in the collection is Shatterday, and this was originally published in Gallery magazine in 1975, but was later collected in Harlan Ellison's 1980 collection of the same name. Now, in a lot of ways, I would almost consider this to be sort of a modern take on the Edgar Allan Poe story William Wilson, which is about a man who encounters his doppelganger, although here, it's not so much a doppelganger as in it's literally him. Basically, the story is about this man named Peter J. Novins who is on a date, and he's waiting for the girl to show up, so he decides to call her apartment to see what's taken so long, and he accidentally dials his own number, the number to his apartment, and then he picks up on the other end. Some way, somehow, there are two Peter Novins. You don't know if it's some weird paranormal event, like, is it a rift in the time-space continuum? Are two separate universes sort of merging together? Is this other him an aspect of his soul that has somehow come to life? And basically, it becomes a battle of wills between these two versions of the same man over who gets to be the true Peter Novins. But as the quote-unquote copy starts to gain more substance, the quote-unquote original Peter Novins starts to deteriorate. But as the story goes on, we start to realize that the new version of Peter Novins might actually be the better person, might actually be the better man. Because Peter was not the nicest of guys, and he treated a lot of the people in his life, especially a lot of the women in his life, like crap, and at best he was generally just apathetic towards the people around him, whereas the new version of him is determined to fix all of the past mistakes. And by the end of the story, the main character comes to terms with that and realizes that this new version of him is going to do a better job at being Peter Novins than he ever did. And in a lot of ways, the ending is both positive and negative because the main character technically both wins and loses at the end because, again, they're both technically the same person. But yeah, it's a brilliant story. Definitely one of the best Harlan Ellison stories I've read so far. Now, the story was adapted into actually the first segment of the pilot episode of the 80s incarnation of The Twilight Zone. That episode was actually directed by Wes Craven, who directed quite a few episodes of the 80s Twilight Zone. The same Wes Craven who also directed Last House on the Left and Nightmare on Elm Street, and would go on to direct stuff like Scream and Serpent in the Rainbow. And the episode starred a very young Bruce Willis as Peter Novins, who did a fantastic job playing both versions of this character. And it's an amazing episode, too. Hey guys, so for this part of the video, me and my friend Chris Espinal were discussing Harlan Ellison's novella, Mefisto in Onyx. Now, this was originally published in the October issue of Omni magazine in 1993, but later on, I think it was published as a standalone novella, and actually the standalone hardcover edition of this book, the cover was actually done by Frank Miller. So the story follows this man, a black man who is psychic, who can actually read people's minds, but he doesn't like doing it. Like, he actually feels dirty when he does it, but he's best friends with this attorney who a few years earlier helped put away a vicious serial killer, but she's now starting to have second thoughts, and she thinks that she might have actually convicted an innocent man, and it turns out she's fallen in love with this guy too. So she's now asking her friend, the psychic, to basically go visit this killer on death row and read his mind and see if he really is a killer. Now, we will be spoiling the shit out of this story, just letting you know in case you haven't read the story yet. But what do you think of Mefisto in Onyx?
I think it's an interesting story. I like the characters on it. The main character and his friend. They have a very strong bond and dynamic with each other, past history. I like the uncanny abilities and things that roams in this world. I went throughout the story pretty much questioning a lot of things, like how he got these abilities, how he's able to read minds, what gave him this gift. But I never stopped to answer if he was the only one or not, and come to find out he came across somebody else who had the same gift as him and has been using it for quite some time.
Basically halfway through, and again, spoiler in case you haven't read the book, but basically the main character goes to see the serial killer on death row and then starts to read his mind, and then out of nowhere, the main character, the man we've been following up until this point, confesses to all the killer's crimes. And when I read it, I was like, wait, what the fuck? But then there is another twist when the main character is on death row. The person who was originally on death row, it turns out really was the serial killer, but he was psychic as well, and he used his powers to manipulate the main character into thinking that he was the killer. I'll admit, I actually did kind of see this coming, but it was still executed in a really clever way. But then there's another twist after that, which me and Chris will obviously talk about.
This antagonist inserts himself inside the main character's head at the last moment and reveals himself to be numerous of high-profile murderers in our history. I find it very peculiar, this man, the main character, being African-American. I don't know if this was some type of allegory that Ellison was pushing, but in the end, the psychopath killer, they pretty much mind-swapped each other. At first, it was kind of drawn out when at first hearing, but after hearing it again, I fell in love with this story. I think I like it better than I have No Mouth and I Must Scream. This is definitely, I definitely love this story a lot. A lot of characters, his female friend and him, they have such a close dynamic, and clearly he has a romantic affection for this woman, but because him being African American and her white, I'm not exactly sure on the time period this took place, but that was one of the main focal points that he stresses. He may not exactly say that he likes her or loves her. He just pushes the fact that this is his closest friend out of anybody that he knows, and that he would never abuse his power. But yeah, I really do like the story a lot. The twists and turns just blew me away. I was not expecting that.
Now, the title of the story, Mefisto in Onyx, the name Mefisto is a reference to Faust. Faust is the story of an alchemist who sells his soul to a demon named Mephistopheles, or Mephisto, and the reason it's called Mefisto in Onyx is, like, there's one moment in the story where the main character compares his friend to Mephisto, sort of tempting him into all this, but I also think the Faust connection might run a little deeper. Like, I don't know if you got this implication, and I don't know if this is what Ellison was going for, but I sort of got the implication that maybe the antagonist of the story, this killer who can transfer his mind into other bodies, and it's implied that he's been around for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years, I got the implication that he might have, maybe not have been Faust himself, but perhaps a long time ago, he's somebody who made some kind of Faustian deal, possibly with the devil, so he can live forever, and the way he lives forever is by entering the minds of all these other people. Again, that's just my interpretation of it, or another interpretation is maybe he truly is the devil or Mephisto, but what do you think of that possible Faust connection?
Yeah, I could see that happening. I could see him being somebody that made the deal with the devil and to live for a very long time and to be granted these gifts. I do see a connection with the antagonist. Again, there's so many things you could do with this story. When this killer revealed himself to exist a long time and been a lot of these killers with these high profile murders, you could get this sense of him being an individual that may existed and gave his soul away to the devil. The mere fact that he described himself as pure violence and evil incarnate, you could even think of him as Mephisto himself. You could think of him as the devil himself.
But yeah, I really enjoyed Mefisto in Onyx. I thought it was a really tight little sci-fi horror thriller. I'll admit, I do think the story started off a little slow, but once I realized what was going on, yeah, Yeah, no, this is a really cool story. There was never a movie based on this, but at one point they were going to, or I think Harlan Ellison wanted them to make a movie based on this because he apparently specifically wrote the main character with Forrest Whitaker in mind.
Oh, shit.
The next story contained in the collection, and the final story of the Lost Souls section of the book, is On the Downhill Side, and this was originally published in an anthology called Universe 2 in 1972. Now, this is a fantasy story, a piece of magical realism, and not to bring up the elephant in the room of Neil Gaiman again, like leaving aside all the horrific allegations against him, I will say this story does have a real Neil Gaiman feel to it, and this was written long before Neil Gaiman came onto the scene. Basically, the story is set in New Orleans, and it follows this ghost and his unicorn, and they're trying to save the soul of this young woman who died over 100 years before the events of the story, and it turns out both the main character and this woman, their souls are trapped in purgatory because of past mistakes. But it's actually a really moving modern fairy tale. But yeah, I recommend this story highly if you're a fan of magical realism in literature, and again, leaving aside all the horrific allegations against Neil Gaiman, if you are a fan of his brand of fantasy, I think you would like this story as well. The next section of the book is called The Passage of Time, and the first story contained in this section is Paladin of the Lost Hour. Now, this was originally published in an anthology called Universe 15 in 1985, but was later collected in Ellison's 1988 collection, Angry Candy. Now, the story follows an old man named Gaspar who is visiting the grave of his wife when he gets mugged by these two thugs, but gets saved by a younger man named Billy Canetta. Afterwards, Gaspar and Billy form an unlikely friendship. Now, Billy, we come to learn, is actually a veteran of the Vietnam War. Keep in mind, this was published in the 80s, and at that time, Vietnam was not that far in the past. And Billy is suffering from severe PTSD, as well as survivor's guilt, because it turns out his life was saved in Nam by a fellow soldier who basically died in his place. Now, Gaspar, as it turns out, might not be long for this world, like he might actually be dying, but Gaspar has in his possession a pocket watch, but this watch is very, very important. Basically, it's stopped at 11 o'clock, but if for whatever reason the watch is allowed to tick again, and if the hour hand hits 12, it will basically be the end of not just all life on Earth, but possibly the universe itself. Like all God's creation will essentially cease to exist if the watch is allowed to hit 12 o'clock. Now, there's 1,000 different stories you could tell with that concept. The concept of a watch that basically holds the entire fate of the universe. Like, you could take that concept and tell an epic fantasy story, like maybe there are dark forces trying to get their hands on the watch. You could even take that concept and tell a horror story with it. But instead of doing any of that, Harlan Ellison chooses to tell this really quiet and profoundly moving human drama about the friendship between two men. An older man who has to come to grips with the fact that he might be at the end of his rope, and a younger man who has to overcome past trauma. And something that the story does I actually thought was quite clever is, in the narration when talking about these two characters, it states that one is white and one is black, but it never actually says which one is white and which one is black, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. There's definitely a commentary on race being made here as well. How this is a friendship that's transcending not just age, but race as well. But to tie it in with the watch, the idea of this watch that could basically end the world if it starts ticking again, it's this whole idea that there are bigger things than us. There are bigger things than race. And obviously in real life, a watch like this couldn't possibly exist, but tie it in with real life issues. There are things like war and pollution and natural disasters. There are so many things that are bigger than race, and at the end of the day make race kind of irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. At least I think that's what Harlan Ellison was going for here, but this is a beautiful, beautiful story. Like, honestly, when I first read the story, I was actually crying. Again, it has this bombastic premise, but that premise is kind of irrelevant to what the story really is about. It's a story about friendship. It's the story about the friendship between these two men. Now, around the time the story was published, this was also adapted into an episode of the 80s Twilight Zone, which, by the way, is probably my favorite episode of the 80s version of the Twilight Zone. It is an amazing, amazing episode. Now, obviously, in a written short story, you could get away with saying that one character is white and one character is black and not saying which is which, whereas with a TV episode, which is a visual medium, you obviously have to pick one or the other. So in the episode, Gaspar was played by legendary actor Danny Kaye, and Billy Canetta was played by Glenn Turman, who people might recognize from movies like JD's Revenge and Gremlins, both of whom do amazing jobs in the episode, especially Glenn Turman, and I actually think Danny Kaye and Glenn Turman had really good chemistry in the episode, which is ironic considering apparently in real life they did not get along at all. Apparently Danny Kaye was a real jerk to Glenn Turman, according to Harlan Ellison. And as great as the episode is, it might actually surprise you that the episode had a lot of production problems. The credited director is literally Alan Smithy, which for those of you who don't know, Alan Smithy was sort of a shared pseudonym that some directors used to use when they wanted their names taken off a project. Apparently Danny Kaye was really calling the shots behind the scenes, and the original director of the episode, Gil Cates, was basically listening to whatever Danny Kaye would tell him, and this really pissed off Harlan Ellison. And Harlan Ellison apparently ended up ghost directing much of the episode, and a lot of it was actually saved in editing. So again, it might surprise you that the episode turned out as good as it did. It's an amazing episode based on an equally amazing short story. And it's also very much a story about hope. Hope in the face of past traumas. Hope in the face of death. Hope in the face of a scary world, a world that is filled with things like war and racism and injustice, and hope in the face of potentially the end of the world. But as hopeful as the story is, it is also about how ultimately we are all the slaves of time, and how the sands of time will eventually come for us all, and all we really have is the memories of those who came before us.
Like a wind crying endlessly through the universe, time carries away the names and the deeds of conquerors and commoners alike. And all that we were, all that remains, is in the memories of those who cared we came this way for a brief moment. A blessing of the 18th Egyptian dynasty. God be between you and harm in all the empty places you walk.
The next story collected in here is The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World, and this was originally published under the title The Beast That Shouted Love in 1968 in Galaxy Science Fiction, and then was later collected in Ellison's 1969 collection, The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World. This is a weird story. I'm just throwing that out there right now, and I'm actually kind of at a loss of how I'm really going to explain the plot of this story, because I'll be honest, I actually have no fucking clue what happened in this story. The story begins where a serial killer is being executed, but then we cut to hundreds and hundreds of years later, and there's a statue erected in the serial killer's image, and then we cut to an alien who has a 7-headed dragon held captive, and he drains the dragon, and I think I know what Ellison was going for with the story, but honestly, I'm not sure. I think the idea is that insanity and evil is almost like a physical substance, because it talks about when he drains this dragon, like, I think he's, like, draining it of its, again, its insanity and its evil, and somehow all this insanity and evil goes out everywhere and every when. And somehow what this alien did is responsible for all the evil both on Earth and all throughout the universe. I think that's what the story is going for, and I'm sure there are hardcore Ellison fans watching this video who have probably read this story 100 times, who are probably tearing their hair out at their roots right now, going, "No, that's not what it's about, you idiot!" I know this is considered to be one of Ellison's best stories, but I really have no idea what I thought of this, because again, I have only the vaguest idea of what is actually going on here. Now, Harlan Ellison later wrote an Incredible Hulk comic called The Brute That Shouted Love at the Heart of the Atom, which has a similar title to this story. I don't know if that Incredible Hulk story has any thematic connections to this story, but that is something to note. And there actually was an episode of the anime Neon Genesis Evangelion with the same title as this story. Given how litigious Harlan Ellison was, I'm surprised he never sued over that, but it's possible it could have completely fallen under his radar. And it's also possible that Hideaki Anno, the creator of that series, could have just reached out to him and asked him for permission if he could use that title. The next story collected in here is I'm Looking for Kadak, and this was originally published in an anthology called Wandering Stars in 1974. Basically, this is about a Jewish alien who is wandering across his planet looking for a former Jew who left the religion named Kadak, who nobody really likes, but they need him to partake in the Shiva, so the main character is sent out to look for him, and that's the basic plot of the story, but this was an absolutely hilarious story. And you could tell it's Harlan Ellison very much satirizing Jewish culture, which he was a Jew himself, so I guess that makes it alright. But he doesn't satirize it in a mean-spirited way, at least not in my opinion. But then again, I'm not Jewish, so I don't know if I can really commentate on that too much. But the story also satirizes religion in general and different religious practices, but unlike the Deathbird, which had a very cynical view on religion, this one, it satirizes religion, but it doesn't do it in a mean-spirited way. Again, it's a very funny story, and the ending is actually kind of sweet. The next story collected in here is How Interesting a Tiny Man, which was originally published in Realms of Fantasy in 2010, making this the most recent story in the collection. And this is sort of a take on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It actually feels like Frankenstein meets Richard Matheson's The Shrinking Man. Basically, this is about a scientist who creates a miniature human, and at first people are fascinated by this, and they get a lot of media coverage and appear on talk shows, but then some religious crazies feels that this miniature human's existence is an affront to God, and she starts protesting, and soon everybody turns on them. It's a very good story. It's very short, no pun intended, but it gets its point across very well. It's definitely satirizing the whole concept of trial by media, and it's satirizing the religious right in this country, and satirizing, like, moral outrage. One thing that's kind of cool about it is there's sort of a choose-your-own-adventure thing at the end, where basically there are two endings. Both endings do sort of recontextualize the entire story. But yeah, I recommend this. It's a good one. The next section of the book is called The Lighter Side, and this contains stories that are more comedic in nature, even though some of the stories prior to this were also kind of comedic, like I'm Looking for Kadak. This section contains stories that are more lighthearted and what are basically outright comedy stories. The first story contained in this section is called Djinn No Chaser, and this was originally published in the April 1982 issue of Twilight Zone magazine. Basically, basically this is about a newly married couple who are in some severe financial straits, like the husband can't even afford to take his wife on a honeymoon, but they stumble upon this sort of Middle Eastern antique shop that seems to have come out of a different time and a different place. Like, the shop owner talks about coming from the cosmos or something, but the wife starts to take an interest in this old oil lamp that looks like something right out of Arabian Nights, and the husband reluctantly buys it after arguing the price with the shop owner, but when they take it home and the wife rubs it to clean it off, they awaken an ancient Djinn, or genie, but they don't set the genie free, they only awaken it, and this genie is pissed off, to say the least. And basically the genie makes this couple's lives a live-in hell until they can somehow free him from the lamp. It's an absolutely hilarious story, and the way they get him out of the lamp at the end is fucking absurd. But yeah, it's a really funny story. Like I said before, Harlan Ellison, he had a real knack for comedy that I'm not sure if he got enough credit for. Now, despite this story originally being published in Twilight Zone magazine, this was never adapted into like an episode of the 80s Twilight Zone or anything, but this was actually adapted into an episode of Tales from the Dark Side. I've never seen the Tales from the Dark Side episode, so I can't comment too much on it, but I know in the episode they had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar as the genie. The next story contained in here is How's the Nightlife on Cissalda. This was originally published in an anthology called Chrysalis in 1977, and then later appeared in an issue of Heavy Metal magazine later that year. And my god, this story is fucking insane, and I do emphasize fucking. Basically, this is about a man who travels to another dimension, and then comes back to our world with an alien attached to his penis. Eventually they do pry the alien off of him, but then he starts going through drug-like withdrawals, and they keep the alien prisoner, but eventually it escapes and calls more of its kind into our world. And soon, every human being on the planet is getting fucked by one of these creatures, and the main character ends up being the last man on Earth, while the rest of the human race is literally being fucked to death. And by the end of the story, the main character is so depressed and even contemplates suicide, not because it's basically the end of the world, but because he's the only one on the planet not getting laid. It's a hilarious story, but it's also a messed up story too, when you really think about what's happening. And Harlan Ellison actually includes several real-life celebrities as characters in the story, like William Shatner actually shows up at one point in the story. An alien appears in his dressing room, and he starts pretending that he's Captain Kirk, and he starts giving this speech about the interconnectivity between our species or something, and the alien gets so sick of him that it just leaves. There's also a part in the story where they find Roman Polanski under a table getting fucked by one of these things. A tad ironic considering what we now know about Roman Polanski. Again, the story is screwed up, but it's also so freaking funny. But it's also very Cronenbergian as well. Like, I could totally see David Cronenberg adapting this story. This actually reminded me a lot of Shivers. The next story in this collection is A to Z in the Chocolate Alphabet, and this was originally published in the magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction in 1976. And basically what this is it's a collection of short little vignettes, one for each letter of the alphabet. Some of them are pretty funny, like there's one about a vampire who gets hepatitis from drinking tainted blood. There's one about Atlantis being destroyed by pollution. There's one about Satan's Sergeant. Like, it's little surreal vignettes like that. But the whole thing is pretty good. I would recommend it. The next story featured in here is Eidolons. I hope I'm saying that name right. This was originally published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction in 1988. This is another really weird one that I'm not completely sure if I understood. Basically, it begins where this guy goes to see this man who has what appear to be like these little toy soldier figurines, but they turn out to actually be the souls of fallen soldiers frozen in time. And then the man gives him directions to some kind of ancient scroll, and the rest of the story is sort of a collection of short vignettes, and each one is supposed to be a different part of this scroll translated. I think that's what's going on. Again, this is kind of like the beast that shouted love at the heart of the world for me, where I'm not completely sure if I really understood it, and I'm sure Harlan Ellison is probably screaming from the afterlife saying, "You fucking idiot!" Now, the final section of the book is called The Last Word, and this contains only one story, that being a novella called All the Lies That Are My Life. This was originally published in abridged form in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction in 1980, but I think later on it was actually published as a standalone novel. Now, despite being published in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, this is actually not a science fiction story or a fantasy story, but for the most part is reality-based and is actually semi-autobiographical from what I can tell. The story is about the rivalry between these two writers. One has become very famous and very successful, whereas the other one, the narrator of the story, is more moderately successful, and they're still best friends, but there is sort of this, like, jealousy and rivalry between them. Now, in the story, the more successful writer has recently died, and a lot of it is taken place after his funeral. But a lot of the story is really the main character reminiscing about his friendship/rivalry with the more successful writer. This was a good story, but I have to confess, I did kind of rush through this one because it's the last story in the book, and I was kind of in a hurry to get this book finished with. I feel like this is one that I should definitely go back to someday, because it is quite good. But again, I think I did rush through it, but since it is a novella, one day I might try to do a standalone review of this. So yeah, guys, before I end the video, here are my top 5 favorite stories contained in Harlan Ellison Greatest Hits. Number 5 is Mefisto and Onyx, a really tight little sci-fi thriller with a twist that was clever, but I'll admit I did kind of see coming, but it was still executed in a very unique way. Number 4 is How's the Nightlife on Cissalda, a hilarious but also brutally fucked up horror comedy story. Number 3 is The Whimper of Whipped Dogs, a really good, almost Clive Barker-esque horror story, and again, this was written over 10 years before Clive Barker came onto the scene. Number 2 is Jeffty is 5, an absolutely beautiful and heartbreaking story about nostalgia and the loss of childhood innocence. And my number 1 favorite story in the collection is Paladin of the Lost Hour, a profoundly moving and very human story that, again, takes what could be a very bombastic sci-fi fantasy premise and uses it to tell a really quiet little story about the friendship between two men and about overcoming past traumas. But yeah, that was my review of Greatest Hits by Harlan Ellison, and bye.